So even though that I just established that fandoms are occupied by a lot of queer people, they can still be incredibly heteronormative. And when I talk about heteronormativity, I'll use Hers and Johansson's 2015 definition of the everyday and mundane ways in which heterosexuality is privileged and taken for granted. That is, normalized and naturalized. So, in other words, it is all of the ways in which heterosexuality is assumed to be the default, natural way. We're often socialized to believe that this heteronormative sexuality is the norm by media and pop culture. So, for example, when watching a TV show, a large majority of people will just assume that all of the characters are straight unless stated otherwise. And I mean, when you are primarily only seeing heterosexual relationships represented on screen, I can understand how people would just come to solely expect that, even though I personally disagree with it. So, circling back to fandom spaces, a very common practice is that people will develop their own theories or interpretations of characters' sexual orientations, or even gender expressions. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but a lot of outsiders will look in on this fandom practice and say, well, there's no evidence that this character is gay. They haven't said it in the show. And I think that this is a great example of the heteronormative mindset. You are just assuming the default while expecting any deviations from that to be spelled out to you. And also, not to get too off topic from my point, but I think that this is also really similar to how people view the closet. You know, queer sexuality does not exist unless you come out of the closet and disclose that information, as if queerness isn't something that can just exist quietly. Anyway, the way heteronormativity interacts with bisexuality is especially interesting to me because people create this binary between heterosexuality and homosexuality, where a lot of heterosexual audiences will look at a character who, say, has a romantic storyline with the opposite sex, and they'll use that as sort of a gotcha for people in fandom who theorize otherwise. They'll say things like, see, this character can't be gay because he dated a woman in the show. But to that, I just say, like, how is that stopping a queer person from having a bisexual interpretation of this character? I think that these kinds of things can actually be great ways to explore some of the bisexual experience in fanfiction. I don't want to give too many detailed examples from already existing pieces of fiction, but I think the character of Dean Winchester from Supernatural is a good example of this. So in the show, Dean only shows romantic interest in women, but he is always very quick to shut down and resist any small implication that he could be into men. And importantly, he also has a very close bond with another very popular male character in the show. But anyway, this led to many queer fans to interpret Dean as a closeted bisexual man struggling with internalized homophobia because of the environment of toxic masculinity that he grew up in. So, yeah, even though the heteronormative showrunners were probably intending for Dean to be nothing more than painfully heterosexual, the fandom found a way to transform his character to explore these complex themes regarding sexuality and the queer struggle. And this all sounds very great and very subversive, but exploring queer sexuality in fandom can often fall back into the same heteronormative pitfalls of mainstream media. So, in our class discussions, my group would often talk about the way gay couples are always getting asked, well, who's the man in the relationship? AKA just pushing heteronormative ideas onto queer people. Pollitt et al. Says that a lot of the time, the only LGBTQ plus relationships that can be accepted by our society are the ones that resemble heterosexual norms. So people try to draw these equivalences to straight relationships that don't exist because they are not straight. And unfortunately, this is also a big problem in fan depictions of queer relationships. You will see these stereotypical attributes of particular genders thrust onto characters who never really possessed them in the first place, you know, under the guise of it being, well, it's just my interpretation of the character. Like, take a lesbian couple from a movie. and then suddenly when you read them in fan fiction, one of them is hyper feminine, very dainty, very submissive, while the other becomes more masculinized, very stoic and dominant, even though this is not how they were portrayed in the original work at all. And so, like, if this was just a couple of people exploring new dynamics, then fine. But this is a huge problem that I've encountered so many times, like I would not be even able to count. Like Dressler says in her article, maybe fandom is not all that subversive after all. So then, why do people do this? We talked about in class how the media we watch socially conditions us, that heterosexuality and heterosexual dynamics are the norm through things like Disney movies. And so I think that after spending your entire life exposed to just one kind of relationship, your gut instinct when exploring queer sexuality is going to be to push the stereotypical heterosexual roles onto them, because that's all you know. That is what you have been taught that a relationship is. And, you know, this goes for closeted LGBTQ plus people who maybe don't have a lot of real life experience yet to know otherwise from this. And I think that this will doubly go for straight people in a fandom.